All right. Good morning again, and welcome to the 2023 Information Usage Trends Webcast. My name is Stephen Garfield, and I am with Copyright Clearance Center, and I am joined today by Ned May, the COO of Outsell. This morning, we're going to give you an overview of the results of a new study that has been completed for Copyright Clearance Center by Outsell, and we look forward to sharing this information with you. As I mentioned, my name is Stephen Garfield. I am the Vice President of Client Engagement and Licensing at Copyright Clearance Center. I have been with CCC for the last 18 years, and in this role oversee the renewals of all of our licensees, as well as the relationships we have with our customers. I am joined, as I mentioned, by Ned May. Ned May is the Chief Operating Officer of Outsell. He leads the market intelligence analyst team and oversees Outsell's data sourcing, creation, and analysis. He brings nearly 20 years of experience in analytic and operating roles across the data economy. Some fun facts about Ned. His favorite power meal is sprouted cereal, wild blueberries, and yogurt. And his favorite cities are Prague, Barcelona, Boston, San Francisco, and he admits to Washington, D.C. Welcome, Ned, and thank you for joining us again for the readout of this particular study. For those of you who don't know Copyright Clearance Center, let me just spend a moment just giving you a very quick overview of what we do and who we are. Copyright Clearance Center builds unique solutions that connect content and rights in contextually relevant ways through licensing, software, and professional services. CCC, with its subsidiary Rights Direct, collaborates with customers to advance how data and information is integrated, accessed, and reused while setting the standard for effective copyright solutions that accelerate knowledge and power innovation. And as you can see here, our mission statement, advancing copyright, accelerating knowledge, and powering innovation. As I mentioned, Copyright Clearance Center and Outsell have produced this study since 2007. Approximately every 2 to 3 years, we conduct independent studies on the reuse of content and really to try and get our arms around what is this concept of sharing of content, how is content being used and reused, and what is, as you will soon see, the velocity of content. How often does this content get shared and reused within corporate organizations around the world? And over the years, we've seen consistent use and increases in the sharing and reuse of that content that Ned will talk a little bit about today. But we'll review the key findings of this particular information and consumption study today, and we will give you the overview of some of the major changes that we have seen since 2007. And with that, we have the agenda. We're going to look at the importance of content at work, how copyright content is used and shared in the workplace. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about the velocity of content. We'll talk about the impact of the transition to the hybrid and remote work models that many of us are experiencing today in our own companies. And we'll look at copyright awareness and attitudes. And finally, we'll sum it up with how you can support compliance and a streamlined content workflow within your own organizations. So with that, let me turn this over to Ned, and we'll give you the key findings from the study. Thank you, Ned.
Thank you, Stephen. And one of the most exciting things about this study is that we have done it for so long. As Stephen mentioned, since 2007, we've been asking these same series of questions. That gives us an ability to look longitudinally at the trends shaping the industry and shaping consumption habits. And so it's some fantastic insight, I believe, and I'm going to share some of that with you today, although I might add, it might be time for us to update those photographs.
I agree. One thing, my hair's a lot shorter.
Has come along. So with that, we can move through, and let me see if I have. There we go. So this section of today is going to focus on the results from the survey. As I said, it's a longitudinal survey we've been asking for over 15 years. And we're asking the same questions to get underneath information consumption habits. looking at who, because it's critically important to understand the nature of the respondents in a survey like this. So there's three elements that we have up here. Where was the location? And we have made this a global survey. So while the core base is in the US, we balanced the respondents to make sure that we addressed in equal fashion those countries on the left. So you can see Germany, Austria, Japan, etc.
Apologies.
Okay. So a good equal balance among some of the critical countries out there. In terms of revenue, we purposefully skewed larger. So you can see in the middle there, the average size of revenue for the organizations, 40% were $1 billion plus, while the remainder were less than $1 billion, but still fairly large in nature with 30%, 500 million to $1 billion. So this isn't a survey of the small, micro enterprise. This is large corporate enterprises and their consumption habits. And then equally on the job level. So you will see that only 22% are individual contributors, while nearly half are middle managers or supervisors, and then 29%, a good third, senior executives. That's not how an organization maps out. Obviously, that individual contributor is a much larger piece, but it's important to understand the consumption habits that we get a balanced view across those different roles. So that's why we have balanced it this way. So with that, we can start with the notion of information sharing. And we ask a series of questions around that and what is necessary in the course of your work. The first one, and most of these today, I should add that I'm trending from 2016 to 2022. The reason for that is it's pre-pandemic and let's all hope post-pandemic, right? So this is the behaviors in the enterprise before that thing hit and upset our world significantly. And now that it's calmed down, that we've settled into new routines, what are the behaviors today? You can see on this question, in terms of publications critical to the job, not a significant change, a little uplift, but for the most part, the nature of our jobs and how we consume information, or not how, but what information is critical, hasn't changed much. A slight increase, but overall, not much. However, looking at how we share that information, and this question asks, how many times a week do you share information critical to your job? We see a pretty significant increase in that pre and post-pandemic data. So nearly a 50% rise in the frequency, the number of times per week that folks are sharing. And we'll get into some of the reasons underneath that, but it's kind of the first piece of data that says things are changing, they are different post-pandemic. The third piece is the average number of recipients, and this is where we saw the greatest jump. So prior to the pandemic, individuals were sharing on average with 9 people in their organization, or inside and outside their organization, colleagues and folks that they're collaborating with. Today, that's increased to nearly 15 people. So a dramatic expansion, if you will, in everyone's circle of content sharing. This has some pretty big implications that we'll get into later. But again, number of jobs critical isn't seeing much of an increase, but we're sharing more, and we're sharing with more people when we do. Another change has occurred too, which is what's the nature of the information that we're sharing. Prior to the pandemic, it was roughly 2/3 internal content, 1/3 external. Now, today, and this is something we saw dramatically change in 2020 as well, it has held steady, but it's a roughly even split. So the content that we're moving around more content, and more of that is not within our organization, but external. And I should say, we get this question often, how do you define, the content that you talk about? And we do that specifically and explicitly in the survey. So I want to quote it directly. We say such as news articles, journal articles, standards, conference proceedings, book excerpts, blog posts, and other content from digital or print sources. So a pretty broad definition. This is the information that individuals use in the course of their daily work.
Another way that we also refer to this, Ned, is to say that content that is owned by somebody else. So not internal, where, of course, companies want their employees to use their internal content, but the external would be something owned by somebody else.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, an important distinction. So what does all of that mean? Well, we have a metric that we take that data and calculate, and it's what we call the velocity of content. It is an interesting data point that we can look at through the course of the last 15 years to understand how fast and wide information is moving around the organization, both inside and outside the organization. What it eventually points to is the potential for risk. So there's 3 of those 4 elements come into play in calculating this. We look again at how frequently individuals are sharing it. We look at how many people they're sharing it with. And we multiply all of this by the proportion that is external. Doing that points to, in a week, the potential for nearly 57 violations, if you will, of copyright compliance. We are not implying that this is happening, that folks are violating, that they're not, within compliance. But this is sort of a critical factor in the lever of risk that is out there. That if the steps aren't taken to make sure that you're protecting what your employees are doing, that the level of incident is this high. And we'll get into some more of the changes, but I want to explore how this looks first by different demographics.
One of the things I would just like to add, if I may, Ned, is another way that we look at this from the standpoint of what the risk is to say, rather than potential violations per employee, we also sometimes refer to it as the number of times that an individual employee may be sharing content that may require a permission. So if you think about it from the standpoint of needing the permission, it's another sort of metric, if you will.
And again, this is not a sort of the simple fact of an article that's been found on the web and shared, but it's other elements, it's standards, it's conference proceedings. It's a broad definition of work that we all, or content and information that we all need in our daily work.
Exactly.
Because one of the questions we get, Stephen, is this seems high.
Yep.
And it's built straight off the data that we have gathered, and we have seen these responses remain consistent, if growing, over the year. So,
in terms of some of the presentations I've done, Ned, that may sort of relate to that, we've seen some people say that these are very high, and I've also heard some people say that they're low. In large companies where there is a huge amount of research and development going on, they've actually said that it could be higher than this, just as a little bit of color to that.
Well, that's a nice segue to one of the next slides, or actually several. So we look at this data by different types of demographics. One of these is by the level of, if you will, of the individual. And you can see here, the big takeaway is executives are the most prolific in their content sharing. Nearly 10 times, certainly 7 to 8 times the level of individual employees. So they are blasting this out to a large audience. As you can imagine, they're overseeing divisions, even companies. And so they're sharing at a wider footprint, and they're doing it more frequently. The end result being over 125 incidents of sharing content per week. Individuals, as you can see to the right, at a much less frequent rate. So part of that is coming into play bump up those numbers. And it depends on who you are and your role on how you may see this data. Is it too high or too low? So that is one of the ways to look at it. The other is by the industry. Some surprises here. And again, this is not implied violations, it's the level of content that is being shared. And one of the changes we saw in the pandemic were that those professions that had frequently been in office suddenly became remote and saw a dramatic increase in content sharing. Law firms, as you see to the left here, is one of those. This has one of the most dramatic rises in the level of content sharing, the level of activity in this regard. And we believe much of that was driven by changes that came about as a result of the pandemic.
I do seem to recall, though, Ned, that law firms have always been on the higher end over the course of the last 15, 16 years. Certainly in terms of the type of research they're doing for a variety of different industries. And we've seen that not only through this study, but we've also seen it in some of the data that CCC has collected over the last 40 years.
Thanks, Steve.
Ned, I just want to add one more thing here. I did have the opportunity to look at the list of participants earlier this morning before we got online, and I see that we're covering quite a few of the industries that are represented by our colleagues that have joined us. So this should give you an idea by the industry that you're in of what the level of sharing of third-party content could be on a weekly basis by an individual employee.
Thank you. Looking at this by country, we also can break it out and understand what the level of activity is within each of these countries. Looking at this again, there may be some surprises with the US being on the lower side and Denmark, Austria on the higher side. When we look underneath these behaviors, we see those with that higher frequency having a higher understanding and recognition of copyright, and we'll get into some of that data later. But so this should not be used to imply, again, level of offense, if you will. It's level of activity, and it's more of a nature of sort of the elements of collaboration within those organizations and how they collaborate. And it's one indication of that. Stephen, anything to add on this?
Yeah, I did see we have a couple of colleagues on from Denmark, and I do think it's very important to underline the comment that this is not representative of any violations that may be taking place, but certainly does point to the fact that these are companies and countries where a great deal of collaboration does take place.
So I touched on changes, and this is one of a handful that I'm going to walk through today that is I found the most dramatic. So I spoke to it. Here's the data. In 2016, this velocity of content, the same question asked in the same way, indicated that on average we were sharing just approximately 18 times a week. That has gone up to over a threefold increase to 2022. So a dramatic change in the behavior of sharing content. I would put forth that was driven by changes that occurred during the pandemic. I think there were some elements underway already, but the pandemic, as we saw with many things, accelerated these changes, drove changing behavior, and has led to some pretty dramatic changes in the way we work. So I'd like to explore that more detail. And this is a topic that we have looked at Outsell in a variety of ways. When when things first started to change and change dramatically, we ran a series of studies around the change on the event industry. We have been following through with that, understanding how the nature of conferences has changed, moving from a single point on-premise solution to a 360 solution. We've looked at how information consumption has changed, how the work itself has changed. And some of the questions we're going to explore here get into that as well. It cannot be understated how much change was driven. And when we look at it, some of that change was accelerated structural change. Some of it was temporary, and some of it was, in a way, net new change that we hadn't foreseen. So let's start with the baseline. Where are we today? Where are we working? And as you can see, it's a mix. It's a hybrid world, if you will. So 1/4 of us approximately are fully remote. That's a number that's up significantly from before the pandemic. Unfortunately, this is not a question we asked before. It was not a topic we knew to ask. It was one of those unknown unknowns. But today, 1/4 of workers are fully remote. Most, a plurality, are hybrid, and that is, we have asked questions underneath that. That is on a range of 2 to 4 days a week, and a very mixed environment of some are given the days and others are given the flexibility in terms of those days. So when you get into that, what the hybrid environment looks like, the data says it's very distributed. Over 1/3, though, are back in the office. Right. So we have a very mixed environment today. You can see this data by different professions, and it changes, and we'll put that up in a minute.
Ned, I don't know if you saw in the news, I think I saw it yesterday or the day before, that the Biden administration is going to end the declaration of an emergency in May. And it'll be interesting to see how many people do end up going back to work after the quote unquote pandemic is over, and see how this might change it.
Yeah, no, we will, we'll be surveying again to monitor that. Sure. And I did see that news.
Yeah.
It's a mixed blessing, I think.
It is.
So, and I touched on some of this data, and here it is in more detail. I've only put 2 of the 3 responses up. So the white space, if you will, are those, and to Stephen's point, those that are back in the office full time. So the data that I had of interest here is who's hybrid and who is remote. So if you can go back to that other slide, there we go.
Sorry.
So looking at it, so right, by industry, we saw some pretty dramatic changes. I touched on law firms. So over half of these firms today are fully remote. I would suggest that that's a dramatic change, right? Looking at that, coupling that with hybrid, and you see, I would not go into the law firm real estate market, the commercial real estate market today. There's very few in office full time. Similarly, as you go down that, some dramatic changes. Some, chemicals and plastics has no fully remote, and is the majority in the office. So we see a pretty distinct difference. And again, often those that are the professions, sort of more the white collar roles, are more in the remote fashion. Anything to add to this?
I think it would be hard to manufacture chemicals and plastics if you were not.
I think as well as extracting oil and gas.
Yes. Apologies, everyone, for these slides. I think the heat from my finger is doing this, not me pressing a button. I'm sorry. So we asked a series of questions to get underneath what that change that we just described, how it impacted specifically information sharing. And
I circled the one that I felt was most dramatic, but there's a couple responses here that are important to raise. So 79% of executives indicate that they're sharing more often because of remote work. And, this is something we heard initially as we moved to the remote structure, that leadership didn't know how to engage and connect with their company. And it appears that one way they've settled on that is to blast out more information to the company. So a dramatic number of people that are saying they're doing it more often. But if you look by role too, and remember, we saw sort of a lower level of sharing amongst individuals. Half of individual contributors indicate that they're sharing more often as well. And then if you look at those saying less, it's a much smaller number. So the bottom data here is those sharing about the same. So you really need to add that with individuals sharing more to get a sense of, same or greater than before. So overall, it appears that remote work is forcing this change in behavior. The second element there indicates we're sharing with more people too. And that came out in the data. We asked the questions around information sharing in terms of how frequently, how many people. We got all that data. That showed the velocity of content had increased dramatically. Then later in the survey, we asked these questions about their behaviors, and they indicated the same. So in essence, their admission of their behaviors supported their results from sharing. So it's a pretty well supported finding that this data has increased, that the frequency has increased dramatically. Which brings us to my favorite slide, and what I believe is one of the biggest takeaways from this effort this time around. And I've highlighted it with two arrows there. First, I'm not sure I've seen as dramatic an uptake in a new technology as what we've seen in collaboration tools. Well, let me preface this. The uptake of Chat GPT in the last 6 weeks has surpassed anything. And maybe we'll touch on AI in another survey. But in terms of collaboration tools and their impact on the enterprise and the impact on the individual behaviors, it's been just a phenomenal change. If you saw my analysis that went out today around this study, I highlight that email is losing its position as the killer app. We always talked about all this new technology, but it always went back to, but it's email that we use. Well, at some point this year, I would predict that collaboration tools surpass email attachments as the number one preferred method of information sharing. The data is just too strong to say that's not going to happen. And that's a pretty profound change in the enterprise. Stephen, anything?
Yeah, I will tell you, I was very, very surprised too. When you put these slides together and you were taking a look at the changes over time, it was also the decline in the email link that surprised me. For many years, we've heard from our customers that sending out just the link is a major way that they share, and to see this decline, I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I think these collaboration tools enable either, right? And I should say, the collaboration tools we defined as a variety of things, but we include things like Microsoft Teams in there, Slack, Google, Yammer, Salesforce. So some may have the question, we also have shared drive, right? So you could have SharePoint or OneDrive, but the way we framed this question, we included mention of Microsoft Teams and collaboration tools. Mm-hmm. And using those methods, you can post a link or you can attach a document and upload it. right? So I think that what we're seeing in terms of that rise is coming off, to your point,
Yes,
both of those elements.
it's very interesting.
So this is where it gets fun too, which is some of the questions around what's awareness today. If we've just established that information sharing behaviors have changed post-pandemic. We can get into a variety of reasons why. But if the information behaviors have changed, has awareness changed with it? Is an important question. Are individuals sort of bringing the knowledge of how to properly treat information along with their change in how they're treating information? So we ask a series of questions. The survey gets introduced in much more depth. I wanted to highlight just a few. And I'd say it's, the first responses here is good news, right? Yes, we just 2020, and this was something that we found problematic, was that in 2020, only about half of the respondents indicated that they were aware of that policy. We see a dramatic change here today. 3/4 are now aware. And when we first moved to this new remote environment, behaviors or the understanding hadn't yet caught up with the behavior. And I think you see that in that first line of 53% in 2020, now rising to 74%. Still means 25% aren't. And you can see in the responses below that, the level of uncertainty, if you will. 20% say, yeah, I think so. I just don't actually know what it is. So important, but not helpful, I guess. Right. But general awareness is up, and it's up in significant fashion.
This, as you said, Ned, is really good news. There's no question that when we are talking to our customers, they really don't even know what the level of awareness is within their own companies, and to see this rise has been very encouraging, and does play, as you said, into the risk factor. The more they know about the policy and what the policy entails, the less chance your company is at risk. And by the way, we do have a couple of questions in the chat about effectively communicating those policies, and we can talk about those later.
Yeah, I've been seeing those pop in.
Yes.
Feel free to interrupt me if you want to answer some during the middle, but some, as you'll see in the next few slides, will just steal my thunder on those questions. So,
no, we won't do that.
So one of those questions is, okay, but is that consistent across the different individuals? No. So the good news, overall, it's up dramatically. The bad news is that insight is sort of sitting in the corner office, and hasn't made its way out through the broader organization as effectively as it can. So individual contributors are not violating or not sending, that's the wrong word, are not sending content around as frequently. We saw that earlier in the study, but today still only half are aware. So there is more to be done there. This number of executives, senior leadership being aware, 91% is excellent. So it has to start there. It has to sort of be a top-down message that's communicated, and clearly it's reached executives. So that's good news. It's just there is more dissemination that needs to occur when you look at this broken out by the different job levels. So 40% are gaining awareness of the individuals, the 37% that think so but not sure of the details. That's good. I think some work can be done to make it better.
Yep.
This is a new question. It's an important question, and it allows us to understand how to make it better. And so what we asked this round was the frequency of communicating the policy. Do you communicate once a year, just when someone's hired? As you can see by these responses here, is it monthly, quarterly, every 6 months, or annually? This is a benchmark of behavior is important. You can see the majority are doing it either monthly or quarterly. So it's a increase. There is a danger in doing something too frequently in that it loses the impact of the message. So it's something to be careful for. You can't just say, okay, I'm doing it more regularly, therefore it's done. You have to measure the impact of the message and the frequency of the message to really understand what's working.
And it's interesting. I mean, for those that communicate the policy quarterly, that's pretty frequent. I don't know if we necessarily see that with a lot of our customers, but there's no question that the more often you communicate the policy will result in the higher bars that you showed earlier over all employees of understanding what the policy is. And you can see that would have a major impact.
And so, to that point, we overlaid this data with that understanding, which is the next slide. And it's again, another one of the ones I find the most interesting. So it says, okay, for those that do it at these different cadences, how did the responses break out in terms of awareness and understanding? What this slide tells me is that annually isn't quite enough, that awareness is only 2/3 of a company that's doing it annually. But every 6 months, to monthly is okay, right? Interestingly,
Pretty significant increase.
Yeah, pretty significant, and not much change from every 6 to quarterly. So semi-annually, quarterly, monthly seems to have about the same impact.
Yep.
I would add that once upon a hire, right? Must be something about onboarding that gets that message across, because the awareness is interestingly quite high, or maybe it's because people were changing jobs so frequently during the pandemic that was the quarterly activity as well. Not quite sure. So,
Be sort of interesting as an aside, the once upon hire, to take a look at how those numbers correlate with the age of the people coming in with those hire, because obviously the younger the employee that you've just hired, the higher the level of risk could be, because they're coming out of academic institutions where copyright policy is very different. It would just be a fun little, dive into that area if time permitted at some point.
That's a great thing to explore. Yeah. Very different awareness, and the implications of that can be more immediate in an academic situation. So,
Exactly.
yeah, it's a great point,
This
Stephen.
is very interesting.
So I mentioned there was a variety of questions we asked, and I wanted to highlight just 3 of these. One, what's the level of individuals taking responsibility for making sure they have proper permission for third-party information? Then contrasting that with, okay, you're in a mission critical situation, are you going to forward information regardless, right? And then finally, how easy is it to get permission? And looking at those 3 questions over this time frame, puts up what I would say some warning signs. So the good news here, dramatic increase in those taking responsibility. 4 out of 5 individuals say, I do that. I know that it's my challenge to make sure that what I'm sharing is compliant, right? So that's great. Slight concern with the increase in saying, if it's mission critical, I'm going to forward any and all. And it's the all part there that could raise some concerns, right? But they're saying, look, given the pressures of work today, of competition, I'm going to move the content along that I need to. And then I think the most problematic is the third, which is the rise in getting permission, and that it's creating an obstacle to sharing. So if I unpeel that, the new collaboration tools, the new methods that we're using, the new ways that content is being put out, this whole notion of breaking down content in short snippets and sort of having it fly around on new platforms makes it more frequent and maybe even less well understood in terms of sort of what rights are being carried, what rights are associated, and how do you do this properly. So it's a mixed piece. More and more individuals clearly want to do the right thing with content. But the ultimate piece there is they're saying it's harder today than it ever has been before. So that's the last piece of data that I have, Stephen, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to present this, and I'll turn it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Ned. This is really tremendous information. And for everybody who has joined us here today, as we said, this has been going on for a long time. And the fact that we can track these, the answers to these particular studies and be able to show over time what the changes are is really quite relevant. And it's relevant for the topic of copyright. We're certainly seeing pressure around the world on the businesses that we're all in. How do we effectively innovate? How do we effectively bring new products to market? And even some of the questions that we have received talk about or ask, what is the effective way to communicate with our colleagues, but more effectively, what is the effective way to share content? And obviously, the company itself has to come up with a policy to be able to share content. That needs to be something that you do within the confines of your own company. And there are a lot of different things that you have to look at. You need to look at the local laws in the country where you're located. You need to take a look at your company policies, but you also need to take a look at what are the rights that I get from the different publications that are offered to me. And you all sign up for enterprise-wide subscriptions that give you access to that content. And it can be very, very difficult for you to understand the differences between all of those contracts that you have. So it's to be effective, you really have to look at all three of those, but you also need to be very careful to ensure that the content that you are sharing is permissible. And as Ned pointed out, there are a lot of different collaboration tools that allow you to do that. And you can choose the collaboration tool that effectively helps you share that information within the confines of what is permitted and what isn't. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that we have our own product called RightFind Enterprise that allows you to do that, but there are others out there that also help. So let's just quickly take a look at the summary. What are the trends and the actions that you can take to help with this? And I think some of these will help answer some of the questions that we have received today. We still have 15 minutes left, and I'll go through these next two slides quickly, and we'll try to answer as many questions that you sent us as we can. So what are we seeing overall? What is it that Ned has presented here that has really underscored some massive changes? Well, the velocity of content is shifting. Not only are we seeing more people sharing more content more often, and as we saw, that increase went from 17.8 in 2016 to 56.9 in 22. But the primary method of sharing that information has changed. So using those collaboration tools with people working at home certainly makes it much easier to share that information with colleagues located all over the world. They have access to anything from SharePoint to many of the tools that Ned mentioned, and even our own RightFind gives you the ability to use those collaboration tools to share more often. So the increase is up, and part of that increase is driven by the fact that people are doing this differently. The evolving work environment has changed a lot and will continue to offer changes. But more importantly, I think that we're going to see that some of these changes are going to be permanent. We certainly at CCC have seen that there are a lot of people that really want to work at home. They continue to work at home, and many of them probably don't plan to come back to the office. And that is going to change how content is shared, but also that frequency. And then we also talked about the paradox of executive behaviors. So copyright policy awareness is highest among executives, and yet they are the ones who share the most. And again, we talk about third-party content. That is the content that may require a permission. That has risen dramatically. And we saw that in a couple of the charts that Ned presented. And why is that? The urgency and the timeliness to communicate are major factors. We're working at a faster pace with more information, and we need to be able to do that as quickly as possible. But that paradox is you find that executives who know the most are sharing the most too. And you certainly have to question whether they understand what all the ramifications are for the content they share. And then finally, copyright awareness and attitudes, which was the last set of slides that Ned just shared with us. So copyright awareness is increasing, but the amount of content, as I said just a moment ago when talking about executives, that is owned by others, that content being shared is increasing as well. And it could suggest that employees are unaware of the content that they have under license and what they can do with it. But we also saw that the frequency of communicating the policy helps lower the company's risk. Now, the major point here in all of this really is you can put in places a lot of different policies. You can put in place processes that will either enable or not enable people to share content. But what we've seen is that the behavior hasn't changed, and the behavior has increased to sharing content, which means you need to be much more aware of what's being shared, how it's being shared, and communicating to your employees what their responsibilities are when sharing third-party content. So it's really the behavior that we have to look at, and the behavior is increasing. So what can you do? Create a copyright policy. We've certainly talked about that. The fact that many of the employees that we surveyed in this study know that there is a policy certainly underline the fact that creating that policy is key. And if you work for a company that doesn't have a policy, please take advantage of Copyright Clearance Center's website. You can find a template for a copyright policy that you can download, and you can tweak for appropriateness for the company you work in. Publish that policy where everyone can easily access it, where they can see it, promote it, and communicate it as often as you can. Certainly, Ned pointed to the fact that monthly or quarterly raises the level of awareness to the point where people will stop to think about what they can and can't do with the content that they have. Educate your employees on copyright. There are a lot of tools available on the Copyright Clearance Center website, everything from quick 6-minute videos that allow you to see the basics of US copyright law in 6.5 minutes, to white papers and tools that will help you educate your employees. And if you have any questions about that, please turn to the company to find out more about how we can help you. And for those of you that are licensed, we can provide you with educational sessions that will help educate your employees. And then finally, secure the needed permissions, the annual licenses, and rights and management tools that you need to effectively be able to share that information within the company, and use tools that tell you whether you have the rights available to you to be able to share them. So this is just a very quick overview of some of the things that you can do, and I think we'll answer some of the questions that we did have in the chat. Now, in terms of the questions that we have received, let me take a look at a few of these and see what we can come up with to answer for you. Let's see, a couple of these don't necessarily apply to the presentation. So let me focus here on how do we effectively exchange information within our team so that every team member is aware of the latest updates? Again, This is really taking a look at what the content is you have available, what the rights are available, and how you communicate those rights to your teams. You can use tools that will help you do that, and you can also create the policies that you can present in the market. We had one interesting one. What are landmark judgments in copyright-related cases? For text-based material, there are two. There is the Texaco case, which took place in the mid-90s. It was a case where there was occasional sharing of content that took place over the course of the year by one researcher. It was not willful. It was really very, very minor sharing, but it did make it to the Supreme Court, and Texaco was liable for copyright infringement. The second is the Legg Mason case, which is very different. It was actually considered to be willful infringement, where the company was sending out copies of content not only internally without permission, but also externally, and they were sued for copyright infringement and had to pay a settlement of $21 million. Those are the two major landmark cases for copyright infringement. How to share? Yes.
Oh, well, I'm just looking at the questions as well. There was one that ties into that, which is around potential violations. And it's not just examples. Well, it's around examples of enforcement. So they're saying, okay, we see these potential violations, but is this being pursued? And you and I, in the conversation in preparation for this, you had spoken about how that enforcement is happening today.
Yeah, great comment, Ned. What we are seeing in the market today is that there are not a lot of copyright cases that are making it to the courts. Then the reason is very simple. Most companies do not want the name of their company to be in the headlines of a major newspaper for copyright infringement. However, what I can tell you is there are a lot of these cases that are taking place today. We had conversations with a lawyer who represented Legg Mason, who told us that he was sending out cease and desist letters on average 2 to 3 times per week to major brand name companies around the world for potential copyright infringement, and settling those cases on average about once per week. So you're talking about one lawyer who potentially was given 4 weeks off of vacation a year, was settling somewhere between 45 and 50 cases a year. That's one lawyer. So think about multiple lawyers who are doing the exact same thing. And along those same lines, there's one question here: is there ever been legal action against a company for using academic affiliations to obtain content? What I can tell you is, and this gets into a whole issue about the difference between the copyright laws in academia and the copyright laws in for-profit companies. Commercial use really represents laws that were set up to ensure that companies that make money off of third-party content are getting the appropriate permissions to be able to do so. Academic copyright is very different. Obviously, students have a much broader access and reuse of academic content or content for academic purposes than commercial companies do. And there is another question here that goes along the same lines of that. If students who come to work for-profit companies are using their sign-on and passwords that they had in academia, that would put the company potentially at risk, because they are using content under academic rules that are very different for-profit rules. And we would certainly recommend that you take a look at that.
One quick question I'll answer was around a question I asked on internal versus external and how the data was collected.
Yes.
Was that self-reported?
Yep.
I want to make sure. So yes, that was, all this data was self-reported. So we asked individuals, what's the percent of information that was from internal versus external sources? Just wanted to get that. And there's also been some questions, Stephen, on whether these slides and this information will be available to others to share. So I don't know if
yes.
you can answer that.
And a recording of this presentation will be sent out, so you will have access to look at these slides. Let's see, what else do we have here? We have one question. There seem to be a lot of legal questions. Interesting. What are the potential ways a violation is registered? How do you avoid them? There is a huge desire to spice up presentations to gain business. How do you accomplish this legally? Is there a list of resources that companies can use to find content that is legal? Really, really good question. And I think it's safe to say there probably are a lot of lists that exist out there. But what you really have to do, and you need to be aware, if you are using content, let's say, I did see a couple of questions regarding access to videos, maybe YouTube. If you are using content from another site to spice up those presentations, I'm afraid that what you really have to do is take a look at what the terms and conditions are for the site where you're getting that content. Do they allow you to do this or don't they? One person I saw in here made mention of the fact that you don't always know if the sites are even legal themselves, and that is a real concern. You do need to do a little bit of research. Just because the content is available to you on the internet doesn't mean that it has been pre-permissioned for the site to put up. And so you do need to do a little bit of research to make sure that that content is available to you to share. Published. Oh, this is very interesting. And Ned may, I think maybe we can do this together. How much of the changes to the velocity of sharing is because of the increased amount of information being published? These data points would seem to correlate. I think we've talked about this in the past, but certainly the amount of content that is available is increasing exponentially every single year, and does mean that people are sharing a lot more of that content. Would you agree? Uh-oh, did we lose Ned?
No, here I am. Sorry. It's not
Sorry.
a data point we got underneath, but it's, yeah, I think that's a fair sort of extrapolation to say there's just more out there. Someone also added a comment in the comments about not surprising sharing is done in the chat box all the time now. And I think that's also a changed behavior that we're seeing. So in the course of this presentation, we're seeing the chats fly along. People often put links in there. They often put a supporting content. So I think it's a matter of more content and also a greater ability to share it and share it wider.
Excellent.
So, and there was some questions, legal questions around why is email link mentioned?
Yep. Great comment. And I was going to mention that while you were talking when I discussed the fact that that has gone down. The reason why email links are mentioned here at all is that obviously under copyright law, when you share content, you are making a copy, or well, let me rephrase that. Copyright law gives you the owner the ability to determine if copies can be made and how those copies are distributed, or how many. So under an email link, you're not committing any violations because you're not making a copy. All you're doing is sending a link to the original piece of content, and then it's up to the person that uses that link to determine whether or not they need to make a copy. So a link is not a copyrightable moment because you're not making a copy and then sharing a copy. And with that, we have hit the top of the hour. I do see that we have a few more questions. We will take a look at these and we'll try to answer them and get back to you all. But on behalf of Copyright Clearance Center and Outsell, I would like to thank all of you that are still with us for participating in this particular webcast. You will see that I have given you my contact details. If you have any questions, please take advantage of this and let us know what we can do to help you. Again, you will receive a copy of the recording of this presentation, and we look forward to hearing back from you in the future. And thank you, Ned.
Thanks, Stephen.